Hello everyone, today we talk about low medieval Russian militiamen and more specifically the better armored infantrymen from the 11th, 13th century urban armies, which is a very specific topic as you understand and also not such an easy one to introduce without a bit of a background at least. First of all, this video is fundamentally based on equipment, so we will talk about the Russian militias of the same centers, the polk, so-called in fact organization, in a separate video, probably in the one dedicated to Russian army organization this time, but possibly also specifically about this. The problem is that with Russia there are a bit of problems. The first one is of documentation, not just because of the relative scarcity of evidence. We rely more on archaeological finds than actual iconographic evidence, the latter being in fact a bit tricky because, as you know, Russia had fundamentally this great influx from Constantinople in arts, in architecture, and together with it came a very important ideological unitary concept that is basically, in my opinion, the only one that from a political point of view, at least in practice, could provide from essentially a compaction of the Russian principalities that, as you know, were fundamentally de facto autonomous, the one from the other, the one of Kiev being the most important, and still, existing a principle of dynastic principality and authority in these the Rurikid dynasty, fundamentally, that is also historically, a bit of a myth, at least, as far as it's documentable, because this princes naturally believed, or at least wanted others to believe, that there was such primate, but based on blood, random dynastic ties. But reality was different, and it's different in ways that are still being debated actually by historiography. That is, what's the genesis of the Rus properly, and not much in the also in the early Slavic migrations, and or however the pressure that they received from essentially the Turkic war from one side, the Scandinavian from another, and how these powers fundamentally rose on their own. Teodorov basically stresses that the Kievan Rus is not much of a Varangian, but rather a properly Slavic creation, and fundamentally there's nothing to be surprised of. There's a bit too much emphasis placed on the idea that some bands of warriors coming from Scandinavia created this system, right? This already existed in ways that became increasingly, let's say, oligarchic in one sense, but still coexisting, as in other areas of Europe, with an important middle class development that in fact had the center in the Russian cities, and that also had their own political, represented a political counterbalancement to nobiliary power, to princely power, and the polk, the city militia expression of the city council, the Vech, as it was called, is a characteristic of low medieval Russia before, naturally, the Mongol invasion. It changed a big deal, right? It was a big game changer, and that can be measured, in fact, fundamentally in the decline of the Russian militias and the autocratization of power, the important rise of, politically, socially, of real dynasties, of real seigneurial powers that fundamentally began to subdue the remainers of free communities that lost increasingly more power. It's a bit at the base of the creation of modern Russia up to the revolution, and something that we will have to discuss at some point, not today. So this presence is very important because we don't know so much about Russian cities as we know, I don't know, about French cities or Italian cities and so on. But they objectively represented a parallel, if you want, of a great culture, great civilization that existed in there with characteristics though that, of course, are not so well documented, in part because I presume they properly weren't so articulated or diversified like could be in the West. Surely there was a big deal of variety in many levels, especially considering the external influences that Russia received at this point. Albeit not forgetting that Russia itself was a cultural exporter at this time, and in terms of weapons and armor, this is evident. We will see it partly today. But the genesis of this cluster of principalities is so, let's say, not necessarily heterogeneous, but let's say that they were so different from one another in many ways. This was a based area, if anything. Most of it wasn't so developed like Kiev and the larger cities. Here we remember, for example, Novgorod or Vladimir also, that were, had important military organizations by different inequality, as we will see. And the militias here are a bit the indicator both of the political and social power, say middle classes, and also of their, properly their unity, their effectiveness, and their experience in a sense. For example, probably the most famous militias, also especially in later medieval times, the ones from Novgorod, that was much of specifically of a republic, very also Western influenced in some ways, but it seems that its military potential and capacity at the end of the day was never fully exploited, or at least wasn't so punching as it's believed. At this time, it seems that the militias of the Principality of Vladimir and its successors were the greatest in Russia, with more towns and larger populations, which makes it even more powerful than Kiev in a sense, than the Kievan ones, that instead were perhaps more framed under the control of the Grand Prince, that had more of a nobiliar power. That fundamentally that the Russian princes had this retinues of Druzinas, and they were pretty much like a quite of an equestrian culture. Never read much of parallelism between, let's say, Western chivalry and what was happening in Russia. But frankly, there's nothing to be that we would be surprised of. For many reasons here we can't stress, but even if you look at their equipment, like by the late 13th century, you look at an average a Russian prince, you see they use basically the same weapons, albeit with also in there with some pinels and different influences, but 1.5 hand swords, or but and also designs, etc. That obviously show the continuous contact also with the West. It is kind of overlooked, considering the most important one, of course, was coming from Constantinople and also from the Turkic Mongolian steppes. So here we naturally talk all about the pre-Mongol times, right, when militias still worked in a sense. At some point we will probably have to, because there is not much of an information. We don't properly know how these militias were equipped, so for which and how the system practically worked. So that today we concentrate mostly on this better equipped units, right? Because as we will see in other videos, that these militias had fundamentally were the levy, the city levy, and theoretically every every able-bodied freeman was summoned in case of emergency, at least theoretically. Then in practice we know that mass levies were pretty rare. But for this very reason, and this finds parallelisms also in Western militias at this time, there was fundamentally a bulk of can say properly elite militiamen, but surely most of effective organized bodies that surely were fairly well kept for broader standards of the time, both in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, and that show this level of of course of armoredness, let's say, and also heavy standards in a way. Then there was naturally the lighter troops in a way. For example, Novgorod had great amount of troops that could be summoned from the surrounding suburbs of the city, but it seems that they never played much of a dramatic role, at least in terms of effective combat effectiveness, let's say. Also, as we'll see today, here we're talking about fairly primitive times. I mean, think about what 11th century Russia could be. The 13th century one was surely different. There had been a development similar in Western Europe. It was very fast, in my opinion. But we're talking about areas that we're saying, before are very vast, and most of which were not actually urbanized in the way we intend. I mean, this is still basically an Eastern European context, so urbanization is something very, intrinsically different from the one you see in the West. There is, for example, there is not properly progressed urbanization. This is properly the historical times in which such things rise in the area, mostly along the great Russian rivers, of course, and most of the surroundings are not very hospitable places in first place, and this didn't decrease their warlikeness, right? So that the urban militia is a bit of an exception. The largest amount of Russian infantry, in Russian armies altogether, would be constituted by essentially peasant militias that were surely also less effective than the urban ones in a sense, but let's say that came from a background that by osmosis kind of influence also the same militia equipment in traditions and capabilities, so that we have to these were not Western Europeans bourgeois, right? There was, even in tech, as we will see now, in technological development, slightly less lesser capacity, but this was simply the product of a different reality that we have to understand for what it was. So we can document roughly what an average heavy militiaman could be in Russia at this time. First of all, a characteristic of these troops, at least in greater amount compared to the West, is the important amount of scale and lamellar armor, mostly corselets. We have evidence, from Novgorod. This kind of equipment existed also in Western Europe, right? If you pick especially, Italy, but you see this stuff even in France, right? A scale lamellar armor was up to these centuries still a thing, right? Also in Germany, and it's a bit overlooked, in fact. And of course, however, since the Russians were more exposed, to Eastern influences, they tended to make a greater use of them. Always given, however, that the most common form of armor was definitely mail, right? And also in Russian armies. And some troops, usually these corselets were worn over a kilted tunic. That would be probably the most common form of armor. Consider that, of course, the characteristic of the militia is that it's materially wealthy. Right, this is a characteristic. Basically, these were great centers of wealth accumulation that could be redistributed in case, especially of emergencies. So, in terms of material wealth and availability, these guys could be equipped very, very well for those time standards. Combat effectiveness is something else, because naturally the most militiamen were by default non-professionals. But still, normally this corselets would be sleeveless, right? There existed also with longer, extension, but of course, naturally it's rare for a militiaman to be that well equipped. There could be padded leather linen hoods to protect the head and neck. Most of these troops would be essentially spearmen or archers. About archery we'll talk about in a while, albeit especially in the earlier times we see that javelins were pretty common, right? Javelins that would eventually evolve into spears. That's fundamentally the passage, how it happens, even just historically. It's like, I don't know, there are parallelisms also in the West. It's like the Norman cavalryman that in fact, the 11th century is basically armed with javelins, no, not with properly with the spear. It would be more typical, more standard the 13th century, and so in order to soften up the enemy ranks before charging in, with still a spear of some sort. And so in Russia we see a bit the same thing, right? The idea that this world was emerging from essentially tribal realities where every freeman would be more or less skilled, at least in raiding warfare, and therefore mostly equipped with this standard effective pack that exists since prehistory, javelins, right? They are throwing weapons and spears at the same time, and that, however, gradually evolved towards more like properly the concept of the spear, that naturally in a militia mostly composed of infantrymen, that would be cavalry as well, but naturally mostly serves as this kind of spear of this phalanx, right, to that would mostly have a defensive purpose, while cavalry, we'll talk about Russian cavalry in this period. I think we made a video on the late medieval one or early modern one, but surely was the most dynamic, at least, arm. But we have examples of spears that were pretty sturdy. I mean, even properly armor-piercing, designed to be, impact heavy, and albeit we don't have a dramatic evidence of what these, how this infantry performed on the field, we can't think that it did its own work. Consider that Russia was, of course, covered in swamps, and forests. So, like in other, but this can be seen at this point even still as west as Germany, right? Areas where that had this more difficult terrains, of course, were more about infantry in a sense, compared to more developed areas such as France, where also a large part of the freeman was now being fundamentally had lost its freedom proper, right? Was mostly in a state of serfdom. So Russia was very, especially in the north, in the most forested areas, like not particularly developed, but these local peasant communities still provided good infantry that on that terrain surely knew their own things. They knew the paths, they knew the forests themselves. I mean, even after the Mongols invaded Russia, basically they stopped at the forests, because it would be dangerous even for them to make their cavalry entering at the forest. So this was true for same Russian cavalry in a sense. So the urban militias would be naturally more gentrified, but don't think that, especially at the beginning, there would be such a great difference, between urban, let's say, it's even a big word for certain centers to tell it all, compared at least to Western standards. This is typical reality of large areas with few communications, sparsely populated, and that therefore also had logistical problems to be on the move. And as we've just said, these urban militias are traditionally also not about professional warfare, so they're not, you can't really impose them to stay on campaign for long. They lack the motivation, the qualities, and so on, and especially they can be dangerous, because at certain points they even controlled, as we have seen and checked in a set and balanced the same princely power in the cities that before the Mongol invasion, in fact, is never able to actually fully get subjugate this community. So this is quite interesting, and here we could actually talk about a lot of things, especially about the before of this story. I mean, how these Slavic tribes would gradually pass through this process of urbanization, change also politically, and also let's consider that infantry was needed as basically an anti-cavalry arm, also against the peoples of the steppes that the Rus at this point were fighting unknowingly. And we will see, in fact, in their equipment, that this probably left a mark, and that is naturally important to counter. Basically, if you have a solid infantry and most of your enemies is light cavalry, where you can remain. It's a bit like during the Crusade. You can remain under a long time under arrow fire, but if you are armored enough and you maintain your nerves steady, these guys cannot really charge in unless they send in the elite that is in much numerical much lesser numerically speaking. It also has to counter your own cavalry that still existed. But the fact that these urban militias would have the best equipment, the best armor, in infantry wise, it's speaks for actually the usefulness of this, because these Slavic communities on the Eastern European frontiers, this, as we'll see now, is to be found pretty much everywhere, even in the Balkans, in Central Europe, etc., were of course about mostly the defensive concept, right? Especially as long as these Slavic societies had not been particularly stratified and by actually also by Eastern influence, in the sense that the nobility looked favorably more at the Eastern model, at the nomadic model of rule and autocracy. This is pretty famous. It would happen in Russia, it would happen in Poland. I mean, there are certain processes of cultural Easternization from the side of the nobility in order to counter the originally, let's say, with very, very cautiously, we can call kind of a democratic nature of the Slavic tribe. That, however, until it wasn't stratified, was mostly about infantry, right? It was like the Germans at the beginning. The idea that would fight on horseback is theoretically, can flee, and just because it's more privileged, it has to dismount to fight. It was an ethical, political matter as well. So the idea that the Slavs would have not dramatically developed, but still, good enough infantry to cope with the horse archers of the steppes is surely a thing, and it's reflected, in fact, as I was saying, also in the equipment. But before that, because that mostly has to do with the shields that these guys used, we talk about, offensive weapon and other cultural influences. For example, the axe was very popular, and this is usually thought to be a Varangian influence, right? Axes, so we're talking properly about the double-handed axe, the one literally you would see it also among these militias that would be an anti-armored weapon, mostly against infantry on a regular basis, to literally deliver enough force concentrated with both arms in this thin, blade that would literally be capable in, the strongest warriors to literally open mail armor, and therefore delivering a devastating impact. Surely there was a Scandinavian influence in there, the axe could be used both as a secondary weapon in place of the sword, but also as a main weapon. Proper. It was apparently slung behind the shoulder by a cord when not in use. And there is some Slavic tradition of these weapons proper, right? But still, some of these weapons properly presented the long haft of Scandinavian time, right? So wielded in both hands, right? But there were, for example, throwing axes in use. This is something that we find mostly, for example, among the Prussians, among other Baltic tribes, but also among the Poles and the same Russians. So it was a kind of a migration era relic in a way, yes. But even about this, there should to say that just as sometimes we associate the axe mostly to the to the barbarian, right? The idea that before the Germans, then the Vikings that had this, even you speak of Danish axes, but actually these weapons normally originated from at least the heavier types, properly the anti-armor ones, that let's say the most specialized in that sense, from Western areas. Right, the Francisca of the Franks is it seems to to actually have stemmed from the Roman army. The so-called Danish axe, actually it seems to have originated in Carolingian Europe. And the same goes for these developments in here. So of course, in the steppes you do find axes, but they're normally small. They're cavalry weapons. They're stuff they can in fact mostly throw, right? So to be nasty, surely against armor that existed around there, because still there was enough, the nobility, especially of the Eastern people, who was, very powerful, very armored, and surely these traumatic weapons together with maces, for example, were a bit of a, an indicator of that. Anytime you find this kind of traumatic weapons, you know that there is armor in that kind of warfare, but it doesn't tell you how much. Right. Still in this 11th to 13th century Russian context, we think these axes now were mostly about, to be Russian versus Russian, right? And especially in the case of these militias here, as they were well equipped, as we've seen, they would do, right? So that's quite important. The shield also, there were different types. There was still the painted circular ones. We find some evidence, I don't know, that there is a late 11th century Kievan frieze that shows this, and it's probably a result of Scandinavian influence, probably. Was used mostly by infantry, not surprisingly, because flat circular shields are the best ones to form properly a shield wall in. That we remember, it's not a matter of, it's not an offensive thing. It's just a defensive thing, and against blows. The shield wall is not effective because of shields. It's effective because of spears. Now, you're not approaching that sense. But that surely, would form a compact, solid front to, fence off from projectiles and so on. And you could overlap the shields, because, the flat shields are properly the ones, contrarily to what is believed sometimes about the Romans and the shield, but the more convex it is, and the more individual that kind of fight that is, the best shield to form an homogeneous front is naturally a flat one, right? Because it speaks of collective unity, right? Properly of a solid, thick, compacted formation. The Scandinavian influence of this shield is also confirmed by the presence of these forms mostly in central and northern Russia, right? So the closer ones to Scandinavia, but naturally there was some local tradition as well. And yet, let's say in the east and the south of Russia, the typically Slavic rectangular form of shield prevailed. At some point we will make a video about this type of shield that I always found very fascinating, because there is some large evidence of this stretching from basically all over the Eastern European border with the nomadic peoples. This rectangular design is typical of Slavic areas and used in Russia, possibly in Serbia and Bulgaria too. At this date, in late medieval times, this would be more evident if you look at even typical the Targe of the Hussars, or I don't know, this kind of specifically rectangular form. I got interested in that because the size of these shields was impressive. There are certain Polish archaeologists making some. We have just the bosses, right? Because the rest is organic and went lost. But they estimated 120 centimeters in height, so 4 feet tall, nearly. So this would fit like a kind of pavis, and there is the fact that the Lithuanians around the 13th century basically developed already this kind of pavises form and whatever. And people get very much obsessed about this topic because they believe that there is such a special, terrible magic development or technology or invented. It's simply, all the type of shield that develops in areas where there is a lot of missile to parry, right? It's the same reason why the Italians developed in the mid 13th century, because there's a booming in the use of the crossbow. These guys in Eastern Europe needed to compensate dramatically the missile capacities of the nomadic steppe, and and that worked, right? And if you look at its spread, in fact, it's like a crescent from the Balkans up to Eastern, you're the eastern border of Russia. That at this point it's not even clear, right? We have a, but the function is very elementary, so no mystery behind this. It's just the evidence that sometimes is lacking, because as we were saying before, in Eastern Europe we have less and less certain stuff, right? And Russia is probably the one of the best examples of it, at least considering its extension. And this types of shield would be very. What's the point? Why that and not a circular one? Well, because in that way you could basically cover the angles that with the round shield you can't do, right? So, and at the same time you realize it's kind of a more static thing. I mean, it's so big, first of all, that it's even a problem to carry in a way. The round one is lighter, but also it's better suited properly to melee, in the sense that it can't, the fact that it's circular makes it more difficult for the blade to actually fall perfectly 90 degrees on the circular surface, let's say, and therefore it kind of diverts the blow right or left at that point. So that gives you also the measure why these rectangular shields would be kind of for a more static kind of defense that would be designed for the Slavic armies to use their infantry for essentially for absorbing most of archer the enemy arrows, in that sense, and making them exhausted against this kind of better armored, but as infantry kind of also more expandable targets. And it's very clever and very logical if you think about it. And I should add, however, that also almond-shaped shields were in use, right? Something that is also fairly common to see around there, and that's kind of the time. It's a lighter, mostly, let's say, probably more individualistic styled type of shield, and this surely evidences also within the same militias that could be mounted as well. However, kind of a bit more individualistic, function capacity. Of course, it would be different sizes. Some of them, as you know, were used by cavalry also with this almond-shaped, so that especially the lower part would cover the legs. This was true a bit, of course, also on foot, but they tend, the shields, as you know, tend to shrink this time, except perhaps a bit mostly the target. I mean the pavises, the rectangular large ones as well, that become more specialistic, however, in nature and character. What is fascinating about these Russian militias, as we were saying before, is the presence of bows. They were mostly spearmen and archers. You know that in Western Europe, the crossbow from the 12th century starts developing very fast. In Russia, it's different. Like, we find definitely a Western influence, especially, in fact, not surprisingly, in the Northwest, especially in Novgorod, that seems to have made a more precocious use of crossbows that were also similar in fashion to the ones of, the Germans were using. This is the time of the Battle of Lake Peipus, so, warfare, of course, hybridizes everything, and that's a characteristic that, Novgorod, even for think about the Hansa and so on, in the Baltic, in North, with the connections with, even with England and so on, would achieve from the Western world. Nicole defines the use of archery by, Russian infantry in general, as widespread, right? And sometimes apparently using simple longbows and sometimes semi-composite bows covered in birch bark that may indicate Scandinavian rather than Byzantine influence in the region of Kiev, albeit arrowheads also seem to reflect a variety of styles and of influences. In fact, in general, we can say, and this is more evident probably in nobiliar contingents than it is in urban militias, for the aforementioned reasons, in the sense that the aristocrats would imitate more kind of nomadic equipment, even just by lifestyle and power, than the Slavic middle classes of these cities would, right? And this is even more evident in late medieval times in Russia, where basically there is no, and I stress literally no difference of any sort between a Russian cavalryman and a Tartar cavalryman. They're identical, and we made a video on that. And I remember, yes, it was specifically about early modern Russia. But it's still fascinating to see large bows, right, multiple wood construction, right, in some archaeological finds, covered, as we've seen, in birch bark. The material was also used for sword grips, shoes, quivers, even writing paper, right? And Russia seemingly also exported this kind of weaponry. That is to say, for example, we found some of these evidence in Lithuania, but we think that they were made in Russia. At some point, we will talk about all these areas. And as you know, the longbow is meant to be used for power, right? This, the longbow was present all over Europe since prehistory and was used literally by everybody. But the fact that it is to be found in larger amounts can reflect some doctrinal choices here and there, right? If anything, because the longbow, as you know, was such because it adapted to the body of who used them, right? So we could hypothesize that in Russia there would be certain communities, from peasants to militiamen, that would, cultivate this capacity as even athletes, because, as you know, it takes a hell of a muscular force, especially to be effective in battle, right? The point of the longbow is not precision, but even in general in battle, precision has very few to do. It's about the regularity of the volleys and how you can throw them orderly all at once, which makes it more effectively than throwing the same amount of arrows, but just over a more diluted period of time. And that in larger numbers can really help. And you can even think, given that anti-cavalry function we were saying before, that together with stopping infantry spearmen, these longbowmen may have actually also kind of bogged down cavalry charges, offensive, and so on. So it's fascinating to think about this. And in Russia, as we were saying, it seems that the bow, at least during this point, these centuries was the prevalent type of missile weapon. In fact, the crossbow is witnessed, as we have seen, as chiefly an anti-armor weapon. That is to say, if you're fighting in a context where arrows are everywhere, like against nomadic cavalry, and or other lots of infantry, the disadvantages of the longbow, especially in a place like Russia that, yes, it had pitched battles at some point, but we can imagine it could be very dynamic, very even territorially difficult to control. Like the idea of the frontier here is very fluid. So the bow would be more practical in some ways, but it's mostly the numbers. Like the fact that the crossbow develops in lesser numbers, still at this point it mostly seems to be something designed as an anti-armor thing that would be even here more directed against in fact less numerically types of troops, like either these same militias, as armored as they were, of course, as an anti-nobiliar weapon against the heavy cavalry of the noblemen, and in lesser part against the nomads that had mostly an armored cavalry. It's not, such a speculative idea, because the proportions here are important and are objectively reflected by this state of. And naturally, here we're skipping all the, let's say the various influences that we find from the steppes peoples that were also massive, and we will see this better when talking especially about Russian cavalry, because if you pick a how even just the military history of Russia at this point is, think about the Karash, the Khazars, they had, they were all about this broader area. It was still also kind of florid. Economically speaking, were very important long-range contacts. Towards the 13th century, we're seeing some warheads that had a design that it was typical of China. Right, and Russia get those influences even before the Mongol conquest, we find, speaking of missile warfare, we find specifically specific visors, additional visors integrated to the helmet, the upper part of the face, that may have actually developed from earlier Scandinavian forms, but that would probably reflect at this point not much kind of melee combat, but specifically anti-archery combat. But even for the Vikings at that point, it might have been a thing also in the East, especially the Varangians against archery. And this is very fascinating altogether, because as you understand, Russia was one of the most exposed areas to cavalry warfare. Aside from the forests, the scene also were quite extended, but let's say even if you look at Poland, for example, in numerical quantities, you see that there is a dramatic amount of cavalry numerically compared in these local armies compared, I don't know, to Western Europe. So in Russia, this would be ever more evident, and the emergence of also the Russian principalities was surely progressing this hybriding with Turkic Mongolian warfare, with Byzantine influences, with other Pontic ones, and Middle Eastern ones easily, right? This is witnessed very clearly from an archaeological point of view, and that is also fascinating because it shows you an important amount of, let's say, of armor, let's say, especially of offensive weapons diversification in a sense, and that reflects probably also this internal political division between the nobility and the middle classes, in a sense. That surely used the same weapons properly, but that had to adapt to different enemies, right? There are certain realities in Western Europe, especially when you see that there is a great homogeneity, because after all, the range of the scale of warfare didn't go very far. But let's say in the case of Russia, especially the nobility was used to carry out impressive expeditions, even on this long amount, and there was a logistical effort. Surely the the urban militias supported, they had something to benefit from, but let's say that were designed to fight against another guy, right? In Western Europe, you basically fight almost against the same people. There are your neighbors, and that are also much more similar, especially in the Carolingian, if you say the broadly speaking Frankish, post-Carolingian Frankish area of military culture, similar to each other. In Russia, you have enemies that are very different, right? And that you have this brutal contrast that, however, still creates a frontier and a hybrid in between the forest and the steppe. There are two very different areas, even just culturally speaking. These guys were importantly developing something there that unfortunately was destroyed by the Mongol invasion. So it seems that by the 13th century, there's also local bonds was starting to be unhinged, and but in ways that probably reflected more like the dispersion and the complete autonomization of these single principalities, and not the original fiction that gravitated around mostly the great Russian waterways of the broader Rus, right? Even if that kind of universal ideal, as survived, it passed from Kiev to Vladimir, from Vladimir to Moscow, and that's a bit always a big deal, right? Of the central, especially the center of the church, the autocratic control on the church that reflected the Byzantine model that the Russians imported. So changes that are sometimes very difficult to describe even, and as we were saying before, even iconographically speaking, Russian sources are kind of tricky because they're very idealistic, they're very idealized, right? They got from the Byzantines this kind of iconic, fixed, standardized idea of a Roman looking equipment and so on, but even we know after post-Mongol times they kept representing that in art, but archaeology tells us something very different, that basically they had become Tartar in nature, as in military, they were vassals of the Golden Horde, but specifically they had acquired this political, brutal, systematically, autocratic mentality, for which it was all about cavalry fundamentally. And this middle class had already disappeared because of the crisis, because of the earthquake that the Mongols had caused. Kiev was destroyed. And that was the most important center. So I guess that in here that the history of the bulk of these urban militias is very, very fascinating, and we can only speculate what kind of developments could have been achieved. And we have to surrender to the fact, of course, we're not particularly documented about them, but the fact that they are still so evident in a sense tells us how, that they represented an important bulwark, even just, both politically and militarily, to certain, internal and external enemies that they were trying to guard from. And we will naturally talk more about these topics at some point. And for now, we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.